February 1807, Eastern Europe. Snow falls relentlessly on a frozen battlefield, masking the horrors that are about to unfold. Two of the most powerful armies in Europe collide in a brutal winter clash that would leave tens of thousands dead or wounded. Napoleon Bonaparte, riding his famed reputation of invincibility, faces the Russian and Prussian forces under General Bennigsen. What followed at Eylau was not a story of swift victory or glorious triumph, but a grueling, frozen nightmare that revealed the true cost of ambition, power, and the unforgiving winter. This is the story of the Battle of Eylau. By the winter of 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte had already reshaped the face of Europe through a series of dazzling victories that few thought possible. The battles of Ulm and Austerlitz had established him not just as a brilliant tactician but as a nearly unstoppable force. Nations bowed to his demands, treaties were signed under his terms, and his empire seemed unassailable. The French emperor's reputation was such that kings and generals alike feared the mere thought of confronting him directly. His aura of invincibility was not born solely from military might, but from the psychological mastery he exerted over both his enemies and allies. Europe had been reshaped in his image, and his armies had become the embodiment of his will, disciplined, aggressive, and unyielding. The Grande Armée, Napoleon's instrument of conquest, was a remarkable creation. Composed of approximately 65,000 men for the campaign into Eastern Europe, it represented a blend of experience, training, and sheer audacity. French veterans marched alongside soldiers from Italy, Poland, and other Allied states, creating a multinational force bound together under Napoleon's command. Each soldier believed they were part of history, part of an unstoppable juggernaut that had already conquered so much. They had been molded by years of victories, their confidence hardened into a sense of destiny. In their eyes, Napoleon was infallible, and they were marching with the certainty of triumph. Napoleon's own self-confidence was immense. He believed that war was a science he had mastered, that each maneuver, each battle, and each march could be calculated with precision to achieve victory. His past campaigns had reinforced this belief. He had repeatedly defeated numerically equal or superior forces through speed, strategy, and audacity. To him, Russia would follow the same pattern. He assumed that the Russian army, despite its size, would crumble under his tactical brilliance. He relied on his intuition, the advice of his marshals, and the strict discipline of his soldiers, convinced that the combination of these factors would ensure another decisive victory. Politically, Napoleon's power was unrivaled. He had placed family members on thrones, redistributed territory, and reshaped alliances to serve his ambitions. The continental system, designed to weaken Britain economically, had been enforced across Europe with the implicit threat of military action. Most rulers complied not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Napoleon had become both the enforcer and the symbol of authority. In this environment, the very act of defiance by any state was intolerable. Russia's reluctance to fully comply with the continental system was, in Napoleon's eyes, an existential threat to the stability of his empire. Despite this apparent invincibility, there were cracks beneath the surface. Governing such a sprawling empire required resources that were becoming increasingly stretched. Logistics were complex, and the further Napoleon marched from France, the more tenuous his supply lines became. While the Grande Armée appeared powerful on paper, the realities of distance, terrain, and the unpredictability of enemy strategy made every advance risky. Napoleon had become accustomed to quick victories, expecting that his forces would triumph decisively and return to Paris in glory. This expectation would soon clash with the harsh realities of Russian winter warfare. Napoleon's ambition also played a critical role. He was not content with mere conquest. He sought permanence, an enduring legacy that would secure his place in history. For him, yielding to Russia's resistance was not an option. To accept any compromise would be to acknowledge weakness, and weakness, in Napoleon's eyes, invited rebellion. The invasion of Russia was therefore both a strategic decision and a personal crusade. It was a statement that his authority could not be challenged, that his empire must remain unbroken, and that his will was inexorably decisive in the affairs of Europe. By the time the Grande Armée crossed into Eastern Europe, Napoleon's confidence was near absolute. He believed history favored him, that his previous triumphs had proven the correctness of his methods, and that the Russian army, like those before it, would yield to his brilliance. The soldiers marched under the banners of the Golden Eagle, filled with pride and the certainty of glory. Yet as they advanced, the frozen landscapes of Eastern Europe, the resolute determination of their adversaries, and the unforgiving winter would soon reveal that even the greatest armies could falter, and even the most brilliant commanders could face limits to their power. Napoleon's march into Russia marked the beginning of a campaign that would test not just the strength of his army but the very limits of his ambition and strategic genius. The decision to invade Russia in 1806-1807 was a culmination of political tensions, strategic imperatives, and Napoleon's personal ambitions. At the heart of the conflict was the continental system, Napoleon's grand economic strategy to isolate and weaken Britain by cutting off its trade with Europe. For years this blockade had been enforced with a mixture of diplomacy and military intimidation. Most European states, having seen the fate of those who resisted, complied grudgingly, if not willingly. Russia, however, began to challenge this economic control, creating a problem Napoleon could not ignore. Tsar Alexander IV initially adhered to the continental system after suffering defeats, but Russia's economy was heavily dependent on trade with Britain. By 1810, the Tsar had begun to relax restrictions, allowing British goods to flow back into Russian markets. From Napoleon's perspective, this was more than an economic inconvenience. It was a political challenge, a direct defiance that risked undermining the credibility of his empire. If Russia could ignore his demands, other nations might be encouraged to defy him as well, potentially unraveling the carefully maintained structure of French dominance across Europe. Napoleon viewed war as a tool to enforce his authority, and Russia's non-compliance could not be tolerated. He believed that a swift, decisive campaign would restore obedience, demonstrate his power, and reaffirm the dominance of the French Empire. The invasion was intended as a demonstration not just of military might, but of political inevitability. Defiance against Napoleon was to be met with overwhelming force. To him, inaction was unacceptable. Delay risked encouraging resistance and emboldening other European powers. There was also a personal dimension to the decision. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had once maintained a diplomatic understanding, but mutual distrust and ambition had grown over the years. Both men viewed themselves as architects of Europe's future, and neither could comfortably acknowledge the authority or independence of the other. The invasion became, therefore, a test of will, an extension of Napoleon's need to assert supremacy over a rival whose intentions he could not control or predict. Napoleon expected the Russian campaign to follow the familiar pattern of his previous victories. He assumed that rapid advances, well-coordinated attacks, and decisive battles would compel the Russian army to engage, lose, and force the Tsar to negotiate. These assumptions were based on his past successes against European armies, which often relied heavily on defending fixed positions or key cities. Napoleon believed that once the Russian heartland was threatened, the nation's leadership would have no choice but to yield. What he failed to recognize was the vastness of Russia, the resilience of its people, and the willingness of its army to trade territory for time. The Russian strategy relied on retreats, scorched earth tactics, and avoidance of total confrontation until conditions were favorable. Napoleon's assumption that Russia would respond like other European states was fundamentally flawed. He underestimated both the logistical difficulties posed by the terrain and the psychological determination of his opponent to resist, even at great cost. By choosing to invade, Napoleon committed himself to a campaign with no simple exit strategy. Once the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River, retreat would signal weakness, while continuing the advance would stretch supply lines and exhaust troops in unfamiliar territory. What was intended to be a demonstration of power thus became a gamble, a high-stakes campaign in which success was uncertain and failure could be catastrophic. In attempting to secure obedience and reaffirm his dominance, Napoleon set in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of his ambition, strategy, and the endurance of his army. Napoleon's invasion plan relied heavily on speed, coordination, and the disciplined execution of maneuvers, all hallmarks of his previous campaigns. He intended to divide the Grande Armée into multiple corps, each capable of independent action yet coordinated to strike at strategic points. This flexibility allowed Napoleon to respond to battlefield developments with rapid precision. However, the vast distances of Russian territory, combined with the winter conditions, began to strain these carefully laid plans even before the first major engagements. Orders took longer to reach their destinations, messengers struggled through snowbound roads, and the synchronization of corps became increasingly difficult. The logistical challenges were immense. Supplying an army of over 600,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses required meticulous planning. Napoleon had relied on living off the land in previous campaigns, but the Russian countryside in winter offered scant resources. Villages were sparse, and much of the available food and fodder had already been moved or destroyed by retreating Russian forces. Horses began to weaken from lack of feed, and soldiers faced hunger and fatigue. These logistical strains foreshadowed the larger calamities that would later engulf the Grande Armée. Napoleon's intelligence about Russian troop movements was also flawed. While he received reports from scouts and spies, the size of Russia, combined with the mobility of its forces, made accurate information difficult to obtain. Russian commanders, particularly Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bennigsen, used feints, retreats, and the terrain itself to confuse and mislead the French. Napoleon, accustomed to decisive battles against European armies that fought on predictable grounds, found his usual strategies less effective against an enemy that refused to engage under favorable conditions. Napoleon's strategic assumptions also played a key role in his planning. He believed that capturing Moscow would force Tsar Alexander to negotiate. Unlike previous campaigns, where capturing a capital led directly to surrender, Russia's unique geography and political resilience meant that seizing a city would not guarantee victory. Napoleon underestimated the psychological and logistical readiness of the Russian state to continue resistance even after losing territory. Furthermore, Napoleon's reliance on rapid decisive action became a double-edged sword. The very principles that had secured his past victories, speed, concentration of force and maneuver, were hindered by winter weather, poor roads, and stretched supply lines. His army could no longer move with the same agility, and the element of surprise was diminished. The conditions transformed what should have been a calculated, swift campaign into a slow, grinding advance into hostile territory. As the Grande Armée pressed deeper into Russian territory, the realities of the campaign began to strain even Napoleon's remarkable organizational skills. The further east the army moved, the longer its supply lines became, stretching hundreds of miles across frozen roads and snowbound forests. Wagons carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies often broke down or became stuck in ice, leaving soldiers with dwindling provisions. For an army trained to rely on rapid decisive engagements and efficient logistics, these conditions created a mounting crisis. The harsh environment transformed routine marches into exhausting ordeals, sapping morale and physical strength. The Russian strategy of retreating while destroying supplies, crops and villages compounded these difficulties. As French troops advanced, they found little to forage, and any potential resources were often burned or removed by retreating Russian forces. This scorched earth policy was both clever and devastating. It denied Napoleon the ability to sustain his army using local resources, forcing reliance on overextended supply chains from France. Soldiers grew hungry, horses weakened, and the overall operational pace slowed, frustrating Napoleon's attempts to maintain momentum. Despite these logistical setbacks, Napoleon maintained his characteristic focus on achieving a decisive victory. He believed that once the French army engaged the Russian forces in battle, the combination of experienced troops, superior tactics, and relentless leadership would crush the opposition. However, Russian commanders, particularly Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Bennigsen, avoided giving Napoleon the clear battlefield victories he sought. By retreating and forcing the French to chase them, they bought time, preserved their forces, and let the winter itself become a weapon against the invaders. Napoleon also faced difficulties coordinating his corps over vast distances. Orders that normally took hours to relay were delayed by snow and ice, sometimes taking days to reach subordinate commanders. Communication breakdowns led to uncoordinated attacks and missed opportunities, reducing the effectiveness of the Grande Armée's otherwise formidable fighting capability. These delays, while seemingly minor, began to compound the strategic challenges, making each advance riskier and more exhausting. Another unexpected challenge came from the natural environment itself. Rivers froze, then thawed unpredictably, turning crossings into dangerous undertakings. Snowdrifts and ice made cavalry charges hazardous, slowed artillery, and complicated troop movements. Napoleon's meticulous planning, so effective in the open fields of Central Europe, was being tested in ways he had not fully anticipated. The environment was no longer a passive backdrop, but an active force shaping the outcome of the campaign. By the time Napoleon's forces neared the Russian interior, the Grande Armée had already begun to feel the cumulative strain of the campaign. The soldiers, many of whom were seasoned veterans of Europe's earlier conflicts, now faced conditions unlike any they had encountered. Daily marches through snow and ice, combined with extreme cold, created exhaustion that no previous battle had inflicted. Foot soldiers trudged through frozen terrain with inadequate clothing, while artillery units struggled to maneuver heavy cannons over icy roads. Even the horses, essential for mobility and supply, suffered from fatigue and lack of forage, further compounding logistical difficulties. Despite these hardships, Napoleon remained confident in his strategy. He understood that decisive engagement with the Russian army could still determine the outcome of the campaign. His tactical vision relied on coordinating multiple corps to envelop the enemy, using speed and concentrated attacks to shatter Russian resistance. Yet, the Russian commanders were acutely aware of the challenges faced by the French army. They avoided open confrontation when advantageous, favoring withdrawal and delay to exploit Napoleon's reliance on rapid coordinated maneuvers. The Russian use of scorched earth tactics intensified these difficulties. As the French moved forward, they encountered abandoned villages, burned crops, and destroyed